Silicon Valley exists because of its earlier history. And one of the key people, two key people in the early history of Silicon Valley, one is famous as the father of Silicon Valley. That's Fred Terman, whom I knew very well when I was at Stanford. In fact, he was an investor in my company. That's the one. And the other, perfect timing, is Bill Hansen. Bill is less well known. And
I've got this in, so maybe it's going to work.
I will start by putting this into a little bit of time perspective. You've seen these pictures. This is from Steve Blank's very popular talk about Silicon Valley, which says the popular view is that we went from orchards to silicon. And the real picture is no, it lasted a long time before that. My interest is in this time scale here, which is before and after World War II. Another way to look at this is in terms of population. I found this very interesting. Notice the very rapid growth during the time of the Cold War. And that was the time when things had changed. At the end of World War II, and I'll talk about it in a minute, things changed dramatically for a lot of things. Again, the time scale is the same one. Pre-war, sort of setting the scene. The big East Coast companies had all the gravy. RCA and AT&T had all the patents, the monopoly. Harvard and MIT were big in research, and Stanford was regional, and in fact it was running out of money. West Coast industry was present, but it was small on the overall scale. The turning point for me was the invention of the Klystron. I know that all of you have been involved in engineering and invention in one way or another, and you know that afterwards you look back and you say, well, that was obvious. Anybody could have done that. Well, the first person to do that gets the gravy. And the Varians and Hansen, the two Varian Brothers and Hansen were a unique combination, and they did the job. That resulted in recognition and funding for Stanford, which in a way saved Stanford research and led to it, after the war, becoming the internationally recognized research institution that it is. During World War II, lots of colleges got big contracts, not Stanford. Everybody else had 50 million, Stanford had 50,000. But Terman and Hansen were called east for important jobs, and they emerged as real leaders, both technical leaders and management leaders. There were big labs at Harvard and MIT, but not Stanford. So they really fit in very well. And at the end of the war, what happened? New experts. San Francisco was a port. That's why radio was here in the first place. The shipping companies wanted radio and they didn't want to pay the monopoly prices. At the end of the war, it was a port. We had sailors in port. A lot of these sailors were radar experts, very well trained and interested in the GI Bill and going to school and doing research. So a whole new group of experts showed up here on the West Coast. Not only that, but the technology was no longer patented by RCA and the East Coast companies. It was free. It was paid for by the government. It was radar. And lastly, funding was available. And curiously enough, both Harvard and MIT spurned additional government funding, especially Harvard. Didn't want any more of it. It was dirty. They wanted to go back to research. And Terman, on the other hand, saw that that's the money that could come here. So he brought that funding here. Particularly, as has been pointed out, he was active in classified world, and that's a world where you can only talk to either your supplier or your customer. That's the only one you can tell the truth to. So you develop quite a personal relationship, and he had that. Stanford emerged with funded research, and that resulted in spin-offs, the companies that we'll talk about and that you know. And in particular, it resulted in the development of SLAC, which became a world center of particle research. And it resulted in the sprouting of microwave companies that were unique because they were venture funded. So Silicon wasn't the first venture funding. The microwave companies were among the first to be venture funded, and they showed that you could make a lot of money.
So did they ever call it Microwave Valley?
It was called Microwave Valley by Steve Blank, but I don't think it was called it then. I never heard the phrase when I was running Cal Microwave, but I was busy. I had my nose to the grindstone. I couldn't hear anything. Okay, my interest is in recognizing the role of Hansen. Hansen's archives were lost for 25 years. Complicated story. I won't go into it, but his work is of great interest to me as a microwave guy. And so I've got 2 books in process. One is the first full biography on him, and the second is a book about his notes on microwaves, which was the result of lectures he gave during World War II that I'll talk more about. That manuscript, that book, was the forerunner of all literature in microwaves, including the full Rad Lab series and all the books to come. So I found it very interesting. Let's talk a little bit about what Hansen did. What are his legacies? Well, first of all, he came to Stanford as a 16-year-old kid. When he graduated from high school at 14, they made him go to junior college for a year because they figured he was too young to go to Stanford. Came to Stanford. Very soon he was put to work in the physics department, and he met Russell Varian. Russell Varian was his roommate in Encina Hall. I've got the room numbers and everything. The blue line that you'll see here shows when Varian and Hansen interacted, and they were partners for the rest of their lives from that point on. Hansen's PhD work was on X-rays, accelerating electrons to study atomic electron shells. Then he went to MIT for his postdoc, and while there, he got interested in spherical definition of radiation theory. And I'll come back to the details of this, but I just want you to see what he did in his life. This is, now he died 20 years later from this, so he only had a 20-year career. He came back to Stanford, and he, with a lot of discussion with Russ Varian, invented the microwave cavity from whole cloth. They used that cavity to invent the Klystron, and they received funding for it, for the patents that resulted. He also was very active in the antenna side of things because he was interested in antenna theory. And he and his protege, grad student John Woodyard, wrote what is probably the most cited paper in antenna business. Then they used the Klystron and the antennas to make the first Doppler radars, the first radars in America that used microwaves. During the war, he had 2 jobs, 2 days a week in Cambridge and 5 days a week on Long Island, 2 days at MIT giving lectures, including the notes on microwaves, and 5 days on Long Island where he had a number of patents. I'll talk about some, but the key one was he invented pulse Doppler radar, and I'll show you the patent. Came back to Stanford rather, and invented nuclear magnetic resonance, now called MRI because people didn't like the word nuclear, with Felix Bloch, who'd been a colleague of his at Stanford since 1934. He invented and reduced to practice the traveling wave linear electron accelerator. He was a founder of Varian Associates. I'll talk more about that. And lastly, his lab was the one in which the megawatt Klystron was developed. Ed Ginston, another grad student protege of Hansen's, and Marv Chodorow, who I took courses from. I knew Ginston and Chodorow. Chodorow was a protege of Ginston's, and they invented from whole cloth megawatt Klystrons. I'll talk more about that. So some pictures about what he did, and I'll go through this rather quickly. First of all, at Stanford, he was working on X-rays. And his X-rays were bombarding electrons on silver plated on beryllium. The beryllium would be what later killed him. Nobody knew beryllium dust was poison in those days. And he was a machinist as well. His MIT postdoc was sponsored by a famous guy named Philip Morse. If you ever took physics and used Morse and Feshbach, that's the Morse. Morse was a real sponsor of his for many years, and Hansen's first publication in this area was the result of his work at MIT. Came back to Stanford, and the department head and the mentor of Hansen and Varian, which was David Webster, was interested in using the high voltage lab to generate much higher energy electrons in order to be able to have higher energy X-rays. Unfortunately, they found it was too expensive. At the time, funding was not available. This was the Depression, and all the money was going to Cal for cyclotrons and to Caltech for other work, so they lost out. But Hansen and Varian, Varian was now sharing Hansen's office as a research associate. Hansen and Varian put their heads together, and they decided that some kind of resonant acceleration using the Q multiplication of resonance to increase the fields was the way to get electrons to get moving. Well, using that, Hansen invented the cavity resonator. For him, the cavity resonator was first a sphere. And his idea was, well, it's just like an infinite sphere, only it's finite, and it doesn't have a boundary condition that is for antenna radiation, but it's got a conductive boundary. And the amazing thing for him, of course, again, not a surprise today, was that it didn't have any external field, so it had immense Q, much higher than anything that had been done before that. Here's some pictures of him working on a cylindrical cavity. He used these to put tubes inside. He actually made his own tubes in some cases. There was a rectangular cavity that used some tubes from Bell Labs, and on the edge there is what was called the big wash tub. This was going to be the Stanford accelerator, but unfortunately it got lost in the rush of what came next. He published and he patented. The next thing that was the big thing was the Klystron invention. How did that happen? The Varian Brothers were a unique pair. Russell Varian was a guy who was determined to be an inventor, so he loved inventing, and he always a dreamer. His brother, Sigurd, was a very practical guy, a machinist. He became a pilot. He was a first-class pilot for Pan Am, flying the Mexico to Panama route. And so Russ was the inventor and knew all about patenting. Sig was the driving force in making stuff and project management. But they realized, and they built a lab in their backyard near Paso Robles, but they realized after a while that they just couldn't do it by themselves. They had to have serious technical help, and that was Hansen, whom they knew. So they came back to Stanford to make a microwave generator using Hansen's cavity. They came in May. They didn't get paid. They got to use the shop, although they had to bring their own lathe and drill press. They got paid $100 for materials. And they got a terrific deal, which was they got to share the royalties if there were any patents. Stanford was very generous in those days. 2 months later, it was in the notebook. They had figured it out. John Woodyard, whom I introduced in terms of antennas, was getting his PhD, and one of the things he did was build a wooden cavity that was lined with copper foil, and using that he verified Hansen's calculations about cavity resonators that they would use for this thing. There's some over to the right. The resonators that were used on the Klystron were called spittoons, as you'll see why. 2 months later, they had it reduced to practice. Sig had built them one that worked. Very clever device, and called the Model A, which doesn't exist anymore. They took all the parts and made the Model B with it. The patent was filed by October, and by the next April, through Sig's contact with people at various airports, he went around and bragged about what they'd done, and pretty soon they had funding from Sperry Gyroscope, who made airborne instruments and was eager to get around RCA, and they saw this as an area where RCA had no patents, nothing. Yeah, so it was all fresh ground, and Sperry came in and offered $25,000 a year. That was what was called then by Hansen colossal. I mean, you think of it now as, okay, that's not a lot of money. You can't even buy a house, but or a car. But in those days, it was a big deal. It was the first funding that came to Stanford, and it sent it on the way. What I'm missing here, never mind. Yeah, so in the lower right is a picture from the Saturday Evening Post. These guys became famous as the Klystron Boys. So, today, nobody knows about this stuff, but in those days, that was big news. Hansen and Woodyard were interested in antennas as well, and their publication resulted in what became the standard World War II radar antenna for the Army and the Navy, the Bedspring. And they patented it, they published, and they also patented it. The patent in this case was with Terman. So you can see Terman and Hansen were colleagues. They worked together. They were very, very respectful of each other and very close. Then what happened? Well, somebody approached Stanford and said, gee, I hear you guys have a blind landing system. No, all we have is a Klystron, but we know a lot about antennas. Next thing, they were building a 40-centimeter Klystron. Woodyard built it. And with Hansen's antenna, they made the first successful microwave blind landing system. Picture here in an article in the New York Times. And a patent. Hansen was very, very good at patents after his training by Varian.
They shared the same attorney?
They did share the same attorney. It was Philo Farnsworth's attorney.
Yeah.
Varian had worked for 3 years for Farnsworth and learned about patents. Really learned it on the ground, and those attorneys were the same ones that he brought to Stanford. They used the Klystron and the antennas to build the first radars in the U.S., the first microwave radars. There were VHF radars, but not microwave radars. They also got a patent on radar. There's a patent for radar. The inventors, who are they? Well, it's Varian and Hansen. Lower left is Ed Ginston, who is now a protege of Hansen's and a grad student who was newly come to that group. And Ginston was responsible for making receivers and all the individual components out of Klystrons. Separately, Hansen had a correspondence with a fellow named Alfred Loomis. Loomis was a wealthy guy who made money in the Depression. He was also a physicist, but he was an amateur physicist. However, he had a deal with Cal where he would help them get funding for cyclotrons in return for being able to come out here and fool around, which he did.
Where did he live?
He lived in Tuxedo Park, New York. How's that for a fancy sounding
Tuxedo
place?
Park.
It was a gated community with mansions. You can see his mansion in the background of this lower picture. The other radar in the U.S., which Hansen helped them build and actually went there, was in a refurbished diaper delivery truck called the Diety Wagon. And the Diety Wagon was the famous radar that was at Loomis Labs. Loomis, you'll see later, was instrumental in founding the Microwave Radiation Lab. So Loomis was very well connected. His cousin, by the way, was the Secretary of War under Roosevelt. So he really knew the game.
Those are good connections.
Great connections. This is correspondence between Loomis and Hansen. Loomis is thanking Hansen for all the antenna ideas and showing him how they put it to work. A little sidetrack. What about radar? Well, you know, radar is the invention that foreshadows all of the wireless stuff we have today. Everything in wireless today, Wi-Fi, cell phones, owes a lot to radar. Radar was funded because it was necessary. It was the only defense against the bomber, especially in darkness and cloud and fog. And it was invented in almost every country that had technology, and everybody had it as a secret, and they thought they were the only ones. We got radar. Those stupid guys, they don't have radar. Okay, you'll see what happened later. In Battle of Britain was won by a HF, 13 meter, 26 megahertz radar on 360-foot towers. Not microwave, not Klystrons, not VHF. VHF radar came a little bit later for fixed use, but also there was a need to have airborne radar to find submarines, for example. But an airborne antenna, the frequencies that we're talking about, triode frequencies, the beam was too wide. And so the beam intersected the ground, and so if you were 2 miles high, you could only see 2 miles ahead. Not good. Needed microwaves, and it was well recognized. The Magnetron, which was inspired by the Klystron, the Magnetron guys came here and studied how the Klystron worked. Randall and Boot invented it in February of 40. Just after the fall of France in June of 40, Churchill recognized that it would not be possible to make those in UK, sent a mission here, revealed the Magnetron to Loomis and to Bell Labs people. They were wowed. Here's this thing making 1,000 watts out of a little thing that looked like a hockey puck at microwave frequencies. It was revolutionary, and it led to the formation of the radiation lab to make radar out of magnetrons. Microwave radar has narrow beams for the same size antenna, and so that was a huge breakthrough for airborne antenna. Led to the victory of the Battle of Atlantic against the U-boats and many other things.
What were the metrics of that B-25 sorties over Europe in those days?
Well, actually B-24 and B-17s,
B-17s.
they were huge. 1,000 bomber raids were being made, but the losses were huge, and I'll talk about why. Because the Germans had radar, an extremely good radar. Much better than anybody gave him credit for. But let's talk about the microwave lab here first, and I'll come back to the European situation. The MIT Radiation Lab was founded by a trustee of MIT named Alfred Loomis. He lent the government $500,000. Now that was big money in those days, figuring his cousin would pay him back eventually, and they did. He also got Rockefeller to put up another $500,000, and they founded this lab at MIT. Because of his relationship with Lawrence at Cal, he got Lawrence to staff the lab with physicists. The idea was if you had engineers who'd worked on radar, they wouldn't have any new ideas. But if you had physicists who knew nothing but they were bright, boy, you'd get a lot of interesting stuff. And you wouldn't have people saying, no, we already invented that, go away. Because there were already government labs, there were Navy labs and Army labs that were very productive, but only at VHF and UHF. Lawrence recruited what were called the Cyclotron Ears, people he had trained. They didn't know anything about microwaves. I'm not sure why that's happening, but so they hired Hansen to give weekly lectures to this staff on microwaves and radar and Klystrons and magnetrons, the whole Megillah. That resulted in a 1,200-page set of notes that was called the Bible of the Radiation Lab. Had everything in it. I've read it. It's a beautiful book. I first thought it was just be a little monograph, but it's huge. How did they do? Well, they had a staff of 4,000 at the end of the war. They made 1.5 billion World War II dollars worth of radars. And the story that I give credence to is that radar won the war and the atomic bomb ended it. And so radar was very effective. On the lower right is an interesting radar picture of the D-Day fleet going to France on the morning of June 6, 1944, from a radar on the cliffs of Dover. Just as an interesting thing. Well, what happened to Hansen on the other 5 days a week? He was at Sperry. Sperry hustled him away from Rad Labs. They worked out a deal where he could be a consultant to the Rad Labs, but he would work at Sperry and bring his whole group, the Varians, Ginston, the whole bunch, to come there. Ginston turned out at that point to be a great manager. Here's a guy who just got his PhD, and pretty soon he's in charge of 200 engineers, and he's doing a great job. Well, that set him up for the rest of his career. Hansen got 70 patents, and particularly in Klystrons and radar, and they didn't like Sperry. Sperry was an East Coast 9 to 5, it's 5 o'clock, go home, check out. Put your badge on the shelf there and go home. So they went home, they kept thinking, and they were dreaming about a lab at Stanford for Hansen and a company for the Varians. And you know how that worked out. It came out very well. Hansen commuted by boat from Long Island to Cambridge every week, went up on Sundays, came back on Tuesdays, worked 5 days the rest of the week at Sperry. He worked himself literally to death. Hansen invented the coherent radar in 1943. There's his publication. There's the patent. And the picture shows that Doppler radar, pulse Doppler radar, which lucky for me is sensitive to phase noise, which is my main career interest, can see down, can see a moving target in front of the ground, even though the ground is 80 dB larger. And this is the radar, which is the modern form of radar that's used in all aircraft, weather radars, you name it, it's pulse Doppler today. So what about the planes in Europe? Well, the losses of our bombers and crew were excessive. And it occurred to somebody that, well, maybe the Germans have some way of finding these coming, just like we do. So they looked into it, and sure enough, the Germans had a terrific radar network. So they decided that we have to do something about that. We will form another lab for radar countermeasures and radar intelligence. We'll find out what they have, and we'll figure out what to do about it. Told you not to call me here. Okay. Who was the director of this lab? Well, I'm sure you guessed by now. It's Fred Terman. Fred Terman is this unemployed guy who was the 1941 president of the IRE and a famous guy for radio. And his thesis advisor, Vannevar Bush, from his time at MIT, says, I'm in charge of government expenditures for technology. Would you take on this lab? And while he's thinking about it, he's making some notes to himself. I have copies of it. And you can see the first thing he thought of was men like Hansen. Okay, Hansen wasn't available, but that's what his first thought was. It was highly classified. I mean, it was called a secret within a secret. They couldn't even tell the guys at the Rad Lab what they were doing. And it was very successful. When at the end of the war it had 800 people, and I think of it as Terman's management postdoc. That's where he learned about management. That, and plus the fact that across his back fence was the financial officer of Harvard, from whom he learned all about how to finance universities. So it was really quite a good deal for him in Cambridge. Hansen spent quite a bit of time at RRL as well, talking to Terman and talking to Felix Bloch, another Stanford professor who was a colleague of his in physics and who was there. And his idea was to bring back the Sperry staff and the Rad Lab technology, which was going to be available, to Stanford and start a lab that would eventually realize his dream of accelerating electrons. Terman, for his part, was a terrific strategist, and he saw as the potential post-war engineering dean and then the provost, that he could bring back the RRL staff. In fact, he asked his sponsor, what would you like me to do? And the sponsor, a fellow named Peoria, said, well, bring back the top 12 folks at RRL and put them in a lab at Stanford, and I'll fund it. And bring back Hansen, and I'll fund that, because we need high-power Klystrons for radar. That's how Terman became the father of Silicon Valley. More about that. Bloch and Hansen came back to Stanford, and within a very short time, they had discovered nuclear magnetic resonance. There's the publication. And with Varian's encouragement, they, uniquely among the scientists involved in this, patented it, which later worked very nicely for Varian. Of course, Bloch was Stanford's first Nobel laureate in 1952. Hansen unfortunately passed away prematurely in 1949. And you know the rules. You're not there, you don't get it. Hansen's microwave lab was a key part of Terman's post-war strategy. It was receiving the largest contracts at Stanford. Ginston was brought back as the associate director because he had management experience, and that contrasted with what Hansen saw as his own skills. Woodyard went to UC to work with Alvarez, and they remained very close over the next decade or two. That's where the first linear accelerators were built, and that's where the megawatt Klystrons were built. They built a building for him. Later it was named in his memory. And when it was torn down 60 years later, it introduced prizes and 750 PhDs. Not bad. They got the job done. It also brought Stanford into the position of being a world leader in research. Varian Associates, what about that? Well, of course, all these guys knew each other. Varian Associates was formed around Hansen's kitchen table in a house that still exists just off Junipero Serra at Stanford. Not only that, but they raised money from among themselves, and they didn't have much, and they needed more, and Hansen showed up on almost the last day and gave him a check for $17,000 and said, will this help? Well, that did the deal. Yeah. Apparently he had remortgaged his house and wrote them a check to start the company. So besides being a terrific scientist, he also had a great heart. You know what they did? The Klystron's an interesting story. They figured Klystrons was a dead issue. But within a few weeks, Charlie Litton approached them and said, I've been offered a Klystron job, but I'm too busy. Would you guys take it? And boom, they were in the Klystron business to keep. They were first founded in San Carlos, which was sort of the center of microwave companies and tube companies. That's where IMAC was. That's where Sperry had put their lab. Varian wanted to be closer to Stanford, Russ Varian. And so he arranged, when they got big enough, to move to a building on Stanford land. It was the first company in Stanford Industrial Park. Stanford Industrial Park is the predecessor to Silicon Valley. And Varian's vision to have a company there, Terman was at that point a director of Varian, and he saw, hey, look what they're doing. We could do that over and over again. We could have an industrial park, not for shopping centers, for tech companies. So that's where that idea came from, that group of people. It's on Hansen Way, by the way, which always makes my heart feel good to see that there's someplace he's remembered. The Microwave Lab built this Mark series of accelerators. The first one was built by Hansen and his grad students. The picture on the left is a famous picture. They wanted to show that the thing was small enough you could put it on your shoulder, as compared to many other giant big science projects. Here's the first one working. There's their first report to their customer. One line: we have accelerated electrons. Must have been a big thrill to be able to write that. They had a lot of trouble. Hansen passed away in '49, and Ed Ginston took over as director of the lab. Here's Ginston with the Mark III, a 220-foot accelerator that was approaching a billion electron volts. And the Mark III was the first inkling that protons had something inside them. There was an interior structure. And so it was the beginning of the quark era. And of course it resulted in Nobel Prizes. What about the Klystrons? Well, when these guys were all at Sperry, Ginston had been sent on a trip to the UK to kind of scout around and see what they were up to, and he saw a 20 kilowatt Klystron that had been developed. And he said, got to learn more about that. These are his notes, and his imagination was that in seeing it, there's really no limit to the amount of power that you could generate with a Klystron, as long as you could manage the relativistic electrons. 2 years later, after he had come back to Stanford in 47. By 49, they had a 20 megawatt Klystron working. Here's a picture of it. The UK Klystron's the little one in his hand. That's Marv Chowderow. They went from 20 kilowatts to 20 megawatts in one step. They burned up a little bit of glass and a little bit of metal and so on, but they got it done. And they got it done well before Hansen passed away in 1949. So he knew that that was going to be a big success. Why Klystrons? Because magnetrons are not coherent. If you're going to have a linear accelerator or you're going to have a Doppler radar, you have to have coherent energy, and an amplifier. A Klystron is the only thing that'll do that. So magnetrons were relegated to your microwave oven, and Klystrons are what's used nowadays for anything big power. TWTs are a separate issue, and I won't go into that. Slack. Well, the success of the Mark III resulted in a proposal called Project M, Project Monster, where the group of engineers got together and proposed a 2-mile-long accelerator. Stanford was unique in being able to provide 2 miles of land for free, or for $1 a year. And after much hassling with Congress, which everybody hated, they were awarded a $114 million contract for big science. At the time, it was the biggest contract around. And Stanford built SLAC. It came online in 1966. But they didn't stop there. There have been many, many other very clever ideas, including collider rings, using the radiation that people hated to have from circular stuff, instead using it in a positive way, figuring out how to make bigger rings, how to make a collider that was linear so it doesn't suffer from the problems of electrons when they're going in a circle. They radiate too much, lose all that energy. And they even have built, with the linear accelerator, a giant X-ray source that has had effect, for example, on the study of DNA and many other things. So it's been a huge success. What about the companies? Well, these are in no particular order, but there were 2 companies, electronic warfare companies, and I was lucky to be among the solid state companies. My career started just as transistors came into use, so I've never worked with tubes professionally. I'm an ignoramus about tubes, except for my ham radio use, which I've done all my life. But these companies resulted in, how did that happen? These companies resulted in the proving of the idea that venture investments would pay. Our company paid 100 to 1 to its initial investors, including my sponsor, Mike Villard, who wrote me a blank check on an airplane and said, don't put in more than $250,000. So money, one last thing, money in those days was raised in a totally different way. It was person to person. You went to the house, you sat down, you met the family, you had your cookies and milk, you described what you had in mind. You had one round. That was it. You had to have the thing funded by customers. In our case, defense helped, but we had commercial customers also. And 25 years later, I was happy to say goodbye and left 2,000 people that were, sending their kids to college on what we had done. So it was a big thrill. Anyhow, the microwave companies proved the idea of venture investment and set the stage for the silicon era, which, of course, you know all the stories about that. So that's it. That's
so
microwave.
Dave, if we go really far back to Federal Telegraph, it was David Starr Jordan and a few others that ponied up the angel venture capital for him.
Yeah.
And we saw that with some of the other companies along the way.
Yeah.
It seems to be a model that we local money and starting the company and getting going.
That's right. I didn't know that when I came back to Stanford from MIT, but Stanford and MIT were worlds apart. At MIT, you didn't know anybody who had money. At Stanford, every professor had some and was interested in sponsoring you to do something. Hired you as a consultant. If you were any good, brought you into a company that he was a director of. If that worked out, put you in business yourself. So there was a totally different culture here that I agree goes all the way back to, I think, maybe the gold rush.
I think it does, and it became hyper after World War II with the federal money that came in.
The federal money made a big difference. Yeah, for us it made a big difference. I'll share with you the day, about a week or maybe a month after we were founded, a sponsor of mine, a customer, wanted to place an order with us. So a bunch of Army guys arrived to have a look at us. Well, we got all of everybody's family, all the brothers and cousins and uncles and wives, and kind of a Potemkin village where they were there in an area working on stuff, and then they were in a conference room having a conference, and then when the guys went to see what was happening at lunch, they were there eating lunch. And so they saw through it, but they figured we could do the job if our sponsor said it would. Sponsorship is a big deal.
That's great.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dave.